History is a story written by the victors. But sometimes, the most important parts are not in the words, but in the silences. In the faces that stare back at us from old photographs, without names, without a past. We are told the 19th century was an age of progress, of industry, of great cities rising from the ground. We are also told it was an age of hardship, where poverty and disease left millions of children without parents. They are called orphans, foundlings, the unfortunate byproduct of a changing world. This is the official story. A simple, tragic explanation for a difficult time. But what if it's not the true story? What if the sheer number of these children, appearing all at once, across the entire Western world, is not evidence of social strain, but evidence of a missing generation? What if the institutions built to house them were not charities, but processing centers for the survivors of a cataclysm that has been scrubbed from the record? The photographs remain, the buildings still stand, and the numbers, when you look at them closely, do not lie. They tell a different story. A story of an event so vast, it had to be erased. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is an analysis of the evidence we have been asked to ignore. The investigation begins with the images. Thousands of them, preserved in archives, digitized and shared, yet rarely examined for what they truly show. Look at the faces. We see children, yes, but there is a strange uniformity to them. Row after row of solemn expressions, almost vacant. It is more than just the solemnity of early photography. There is a disconnect, a shared trauma that seems to hang in the air. Their clothing is often identical, coarse, ill-fitting uniforms that strip them of any individuality. They are not dressed as children of the poor, they are dressed as inmates. They are presented not as a family, but as an inventory. Look at their surroundings. The buildings they are housed in are vast, imposing, and strangely ornate. These are not simple shelters cobbled together by well-meaning charities. These are architectural statements. Carved stone, soaring columns, intricate brickwork. They look less like orphanages and more like palaces or government ministries. And many of them appear old, weathered, as if they have stood for centuries, even though official records often claim they were constructed in just a few years in the mid to late 1800s. Does this architecture match the supposed function? Why build such grandiose, monumental structures simply to house unwanted children? The scale is another anomaly. A photograph will show 500 children standing before a single building. Another will show 1,000. These are not small, local operations. These are industrial-scale facilities. The sheer visual evidence forces a question. Where did all of these children come from, all at once? The group photos lack a clear age distribution. You do not see a natural spread of infants, toddlers, and teenagers. Instead, you often see large cohorts of children all around the same age, as if an entire year group was rendered parentless simultaneously. This is not how poverty or disease works. Those forces are random, affecting families unevenly. What we are seeing in these photographs looks systematic. It looks managed. The children are posed, catalogued, and displayed in front of these enormous, out-of-place buildings. The visual record is not one of charity. It is one of collection and processing. It is a silent testament to a demographic event of unimaginable scale, one that required an infrastructure of containment that has been mislabeled as benevolence. Beyond the unsettling visuals lies a problem of pure logistics. The official narrative asks us to believe that these colossal institutions were funded and built by local philanthropists and church groups in response to a growing social need. But let's consider the practical reality of the 19th century. To construct a single one of these multi-story stone and brick buildings would require a level of organization, material sourcing, and skilled labor that was immense. Quarries would need to be commissioned. Thousands of tons of stone shaped and transported. Millions of bricks fired and laid. Intricate woodwork and ironwork forged. Who were these master builders? Where are the records of their construction contracts? Often, they are missing or suspiciously vague. Now, multiply this effort by the hundreds of such institutions that appeared in a very short span of time across the United States, Canada, Australia, and Europe. The timeline makes no sense. We are meant to believe that a society, while simultaneously building its railroads, factories, and cities, also had the spare capacity to erect a parallel infrastructure of massive child repositories. But the buildings are just the beginning. The truly staggering challenge is the operation. Consider an orphanage with 1,000 children in 1880. That is 1,000 beds, 1,000 sets of clothing, 1,000 pairs of shoes. That is 3,000 meals a day, every day. Where did this food come from? It required a supply chain comparable to that of a military battalion. It required farms, delivery networks, industrial-sized kitchens, and staff to run them. Who paid for it? Day after day, year after year. The official answer is donations. But the scale of the need far exceeds what private charity could realistically provide in a consistent and coordinated way across an entire continent. Then there is the question of staffing. Who were the thousands of administrators, caretakers, and teachers? They appear to have been trained and deployed with remarkable efficiency, operating under a standardized model of child rearing that focused on discipline and labor. It implies a centralized system of training and doctrine, not a patchwork of local efforts. And perhaps most perplexing of all are the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929 in America alone, over 200,000 children were put on trains and shipped from eastern cities to the Midwest. This was not a simple act of charity. It was a state-scale relocation program. It required the cooperation of multiple railroad companies, the establishment of placement agencies in distant states, a system of tracking and documentation, and a legal framework to facilitate it. This logistical feat is presented as a simple solution to urban crowding. But it looks less like philanthropy and more like a deliberate redistribution of a surviving population. The practical impossibility is this: the system is too big, too standardized, and too well funded to be the product of spontaneous, local charity. Its existence implies a central authority, a vast budget, and a singular, unspoken purpose. When confronted with a puzzle of this magnitude, we must turn to the official explanation. The story we are given is that the Industrial Revolution, combined with waves of immigration and periodic disease outbreaks, created a social crisis. Men died in factory accidents, families were broken apart by the harsh realities of urban poverty, and newly arrived immigrants sometimes perished, leaving their children behind. All of these things did happen. No one denies the hardships of the era. The failure of this explanation is not that it is false, but that it is profoundly insufficient. It fails on the grounds of scale. Industrial accidents, while tragic, could not produce millions of orphans. The number of adult deaths from such events was a statistical drop in the bucket compared to the tidal wave of parentless children entering these institutions. Poverty is a more common explanation, but it too falls short. For most of history, poverty did not mean the automatic surrender of one's children. The extended family, aunts, uncles, grandparents, was the primary social safety net. For the state to become the default caretaker on this scale, the entire family structure of millions of people would have to have collapsed all at once. Why did it? The records of these children offer no clarity. In fact, they seem designed to obscure it. When you examine the intake logs from these asylums, you find a disturbing pattern of vagueness. A child's origin is often listed with a single word: foundling, abandoned, or destitute. Parents' names are frequently marked unknown or deceased, with no further details. No cause of death, no last known address. It's a bureaucratic template, repeated thousands upon thousands of times. There are rarely birth certificates. The child's age is often an estimation, a guess made by an intake officer. The child effectively has no past before the moment they enter the institution. Their history begins with the state. Is this simply poor record-keeping? Or is it the deliberate creation of a clean slate? This lack of detail is a systemic failure of the official story. If these children were the products of local, individual tragedies, there should be a corresponding variety of local, individual records. There should be police reports, church records, family letters. Instead, there is a bureaucratic silence. The system that was so brilliantly capable of transporting, housing, and feeding millions seems utterly incapable of remembering where they came from. The official story is an explanation that explains nothing. It provides a comfortable, yet logically flawed, justification for a demographic anomaly that points to a far more disturbing origin. If this were a purely American phenomenon, one might try to explain it away with unique local factors like westward expansion or immigration. But it is not. The moment you broaden the scope of the investigation, a global pattern emerges that is impossible to ignore. The same story unfolds, at the same time, in nearly every developing Western nation. In Victorian England, the workhouses and industrial schools swelled with an unprecedented number of children. In Australia, a continent away, vast orphanages were being constructed in Sydney and Melbourne, filled with children who were said to be the unfortunate offspring of the gold rush. In Russia, a network of imperial orphanages took in hundreds of thousands. France, Italy, Canada. The pattern is the same. This synchronous appearance is the most damning evidence against the official narrative. How could dozens of independent nations, each with its own unique social and economic trajectory, all experience the exact same demographic crisis at the exact same time? Industrialization did not happen overnight, nor did it occur at the same pace everywhere. A factory accident in Manchester should have no bearing on the number of orphans in Chicago or the number of foundlings in Melbourne. Yet the system to manage them, these enormous, architecturally similar institutions, springs up everywhere in the same narrow window of the 19th century. The methods are also eerily similar. The model of the austere, disciplined institution focused on manual labor and basic education became the global standard. Programs similar to America's orphan trains existed elsewhere. Britain sent over 100,000 home children to Canada, Australia, and other parts of the empire, a practice that continued into the 20th century. This was a global redistribution of a generation. What could possibly have caused such a coordinated, worldwide event? A war? There were no global wars during much of this period that could account for such numbers. A pandemic? The great plagues of the 19th century, like cholera, were deadly, but their mortality patterns do not explain the specific phenomenon of orphaned children on this scale, nor the sudden ability to build a massive infrastructure to house them. The global pattern suggests a global cause. It suggests a single, shared event that affected all of these nations simultaneously. An event that was so profound it necessitated a coordinated, international response. A response designed not just to care for the survivors, but to manage and control the narrative of what had happened, by erasing the history of the children who were left behind. The similarity in the solution implies a similarity in the problem. And that problem was global. Let us set aside the photographs and the official stories, and focus on the cold, hard logic of numbers. This is where the narrative completely unravels. We will use conservative estimates. By the late 19th century, there were hundreds of thousands of children living in institutional care in the United States alone. The orphan train movement transported over 200,000. In Britain, the numbers were in the hundreds of thousands as well. Let's aggregate this and propose a conservative figure of at least 2 million children processed by these systems across the Western world during the latter half of the 19th century. Now, let's work backwards. The average family size was larger then, but let us use a simple ratio of 2 parents for every 3 children. To produce 2 million orphans, you would need to remove the parents of those children. That would equate to roughly 1.3 million adults who either died, or simultaneously abandoned their parental duties. The total population of the United States in 1880 was about 50 million. The number of orphans in its system represented a significant percentage of the entire youth population. Let's perform a simple thought experiment. Take a hypothetical city of 100,000 people. Records show a new asylum is built to house 2,000 children. That is 2% of the entire population, and perhaps 5 to 7% of the total child population. To generate 2,000 orphans from local tragedies, you would need a catastrophe. The official causes are industrial accidents, disease, and poverty. A major cholera outbreak in the 19th century might kill 1% of a city's population, but it killed indiscriminately children, parents, and the elderly. It would not produce a demographic skew of only orphans. Factory accidents were measured in the dozens, not thousands. This leaves abandonment due to poverty. Are we to believe that in a single city, the parents of 2,000 children simply gave up? That the entire extended family network for all of them failed at the same time? The math does not support this. It creates a deficit. The number of children entering the system is far greater than the number of parents reported to have died from conventional causes. There is a missing cohort. A ghost generation in the census data. Where are the parents of these millions of children? If they died of disease, where are the mass graves? If they died in industrial accidents, where are the employment records? If they abandoned their children, where did they go? The numbers point to a single, stark conclusion. A massive, unrecorded die-off of adults in their prime child-rearing years. An event that was not a gradual social trend, but a sharp, brutal culling of the population. The number of children is the remainder of a subtraction problem. And the larger number, the parent generation, has been erased from the equation. The evidence presents us with a series of contradictions. The official narrative is mathematically impossible. The logistics of the response suggest a level of central planning far beyond mere charity. The global synchronicity of the event rules out local causes. When faced with such a profound failure of the accepted story, we must construct a new hypothesis, based only on the facts before us. This is not a theory of fantasy or speculation. It is a controlled hypothesis, built from the available data. The hypothesis is this: sometime in the 19th century, the Western world experienced a cataclysmic event. This event was not a war, not a known plague, and not an industrial revolution. It was an event that disproportionately eliminated the adult population, leaving behind millions of children. The precise nature of the event is unknown, because its history has been deliberately and systematically erased. Following this reset, the surviving authorities, or a new power structure, initiated a massive cleanup operation. The millions of surviving children were not orphans in the traditional sense. They were the inheritors of a world they were not allowed to remember. The institutions built to house them were not orphanages. They were resettlement and re-education centers. Their purpose was twofold. First, to provide the basic necessities of life to prevent a complete societal collapse. Second, and more importantly, to create a new generation with no memory of the world that came before. By severing the link to their parents, their heritage, and their history, you create a blank slate. A population that knows only the new order. The vague record-keeping was not a mistake, it was a policy. The standardized, dehumanizing uniforms were not about cost saving. They were about erasing individuality and prior identity. The orphan trains and child migration schemes were not about providing better lives. They were about breaking up communities and scattering the survivors to prevent them from sharing memories of the past. The grand, imposing architecture was meant to project power and permanence for the new system. This hypothesis resolves all the contradictions. It explains the sudden, massive number of children. It explains the funding and logistical capacity required to manage them. It explains the global, coordinated nature of the response. And it explains the deliberate silence in the historical record. We are not looking at the byproducts of poverty. We are looking at the managed aftermath of a global depopulation event. The children were the raw material for a new world, built upon the ruins of the old one. We are left with a profound and unsettling picture. A history that feels incomplete, papered over with simple explanations that crumble under the slightest pressure. The faces of these millions of children stare out from the past, asking a silent question. Who were they? Where did they come from? And what happened to their world? The official story of industrialization and poverty is no longer a sufficient answer. The numbers do not support it. The logistical evidence contradicts it. The global pattern makes it impossible. We have examined the visual record, the practical impossibilities, the failure of the official narrative, the global synchronicity, and the stark logic of the numbers themselves. Each line of inquiry leads away from the accepted history and towards a single, controlled hypothesis: that our modern world was built upon a foundation of silence, and that the 19th century was not a beginning, but an aftermath. An aftermath that was carefully managed, documented, and then forgotten. This investigation does not provide the final answer of what the event was. Its purpose is to demonstrate that the questions themselves are valid, and that the evidence for a hidden history is overwhelming. The proof is not buried in a secret vault. It is hiding in plain sight, in our city archives, in the architecture of our oldest public buildings, and in the faded photographs of a generation of children without a past. The story of our world may be fundamentally different from what we have been taught. The only way to find out is to question everything. Look at the old buildings in your own town. The former asylums, the old orphanages. Ask yourself if their scale and design make sense for their stated purpose. Look at the old records. Notice the gaps, the silences, the unanswered questions. The truth is in the details. If you wish to continue this investigation into the lost parts of our history, join us as we continue to examine the record.